Hello. Okay, so we've got our last 2 weeks here, which is really wild. And I've decided to end. We're going to think about a thematic link, which I've got here, belonging. The other thematic link is this idea of everything being rainbow, a moment where something shoots through the clouds. And as I'll present today, that can be both good or bad. We'll end this whole unit at the end of the year, thinking about what is a moment for you where something came through, an ineffable moment where something became clear. And in each of the poems that I describe here today, that's happening. Now, the last thread through all of this is we're going to stay largely in the world of form. No one knows this better than Marilyn Nelson, so I'm going to assign an essay, brief excerpt from an essay about that. Our standards of focus are the big ones. In the world of poetry, everything comes down to these two. Explain the function of specific words and phrases, and then explain the structure. What is the meaning of the text? Why do I think that? Specifically, what words and phrases point to the meaning? And then what structure illuminates that meaning? So here's that broken down across the tasks for the week. I'm giving you a series of poems. I'm asking you to read them all and then choose the one most compelling to you. Today, we'll think about its words and phrases. The grammar and craft lesson is me presenting on how to use evidence well, just a really specific moment. And then your organization assignment will be structure. So words and structure, that's everything, right, in a poem. And here is Marilyn Nelson, who is the cornerstone of my tradition and form understanding. So she writes a lot of wonderful poetry, including a free verse poem that was on the AP Lit exam a few years ago called The Century Quilt. You can take a moment to read the bio here. Just press pause. Okay, so this essay that she writes, which is wonderful in its entirety, is clipped here for you in, I think, the most critical moments towards the end, where she makes a case that it is dangerous to create small enclaves within a literary tradition where people inherit only the tradition they feel that is theirs. She argues, if you are to be a poet, if you are to be a writer, you must honor all of the tradition because it all belongs to you. And she focuses on the metrical tradition, which includes sonnets and the other forms that we're going to look at. I clip some of my favorite writing here at the end. She writes, for many of today's poets, the metrical tradition is a prison, and writing in verse is a drudgery, like extra homework. For them, form is a straitjacket. A metrical language is as stiff as starch. Most of us have lost what Alan Shapiro calls an instinctive sense of the delicate and subtle tensions between stress and accent, rhythm and meter, repetition and surprise, which the best poems in the tradition illustrate. Yes, writing in traditional form is taxing, but it's also liberating. This is her entire thesis, that one must write in form if you are to understand free verse. And for her, those worlds are political. They are culturally tied up in all sorts of signifiers. And so you rejecting the tradition are also rejecting everybody who embodied that tradition. For Marilyn Nelson, she says that's not okay. You have to own the masters. One must own the tradition, study it, understand it, and its masters in order to be truly free. You cannot explore ultimate freedom until you're given first to restriction. And this is what one of my poetry professors used to call adherence to unnecessary obstacles. Why? Well, why do sports exist? All they are is adherence to unnecessary obstacles. Because in so doing, in adhering to something you must not have to adhere to, you can explore true excellence, where everybody is measured in the same way. It is the measure that upsets people. How can you measure me? But it is the measure that actually allows for that glory and greatness to reveal itself most clearly. That's Nelson's argument, and I agree. So, in the AP Lit exam, there is not necessarily a need to be a proponent of the traditional forms, but it is good to have touched them. And so we're going to spend a little bit of time this week reminding ourselves of that. Here's my analogy I always use. It's Picasso. So in 1896, when he was a young painter, 15, he did this on the left. First Communion. It's representational portraits at its best. The lighting, the details are all attempting to be as quote-unquote accurate as possible, visually representative. And on the right, we have him 40 years later in his one of many more abstract paintings, Two Girls Reading. So he can do both, and that's the point. Marilyn Nelson says, if you want to be great, you have got to emulate the greats and then form your own greatness. You have to contribute your own verse, but not without having read the entire poem itself. So I love this visual representation of that. So that's the form. Now the message, which is very much tied up with form. My thematic link is love and belonging. So each of the poems that you're reading, for me, are tied up in this idea that I've written out, that love is possible only really in a real way if your own ego is crushed. There lives belonging. In each of these poems, the speaker loses their ego and their self-centeredness, which is wonderful or awful, depending on what the poet believes or the speaker in that moment. So you can choose from the variety that I've given you, and depending on which is most compelling to you, you'll find a poem where love has been claimed or love is gone. And yet, they are also linked by form. So there's a few sonnets you can choose from. A sonnet is this is a review from really your earlier years in high school. You've seen them many times before. In this course, you've seen The Ovenbird by Robert Frost. There's forms that change a little bit within the world of sonnet. The rhyme scheme changes depending on whether you're talking about an Italian sonnet or an English sonnet or a Spenserian sonnet. But they all have this in common. If it's square, in visual form, looks square, it's a sonnet. That's William Foster from How to Read Literature Like a Professor. And that squareness comes from the fact that all sonnets are 14 lines and that most sonnets are 10 syllables across, so 10 by 14. It's loose, those syllabic counts. It usually is that they're in iambic pentameter meter. Again, that might be review. You might have studied that in earlier years. It's not critical to the AP Lit exam that you've memorized all of those different meters, but it is good for you to know that sonnets have a metrical feel, a metrical unit that's guiding the rhythms. And often that is iambic pentameter, unstressed, stressed. 5 feet of that just means there's going to be 10 syllables of iambic pentameter. Meter, though, the rhythm of the poem, the song of the poem, is important not because it is something to memorize, but because it's what gives the sonnet its song-like feel. And sonnet indeed means little song. So here's my example that I'm giving to you. It's the Gwendolyn Brooks one in your packets. Perhaps you'll choose it. I'm using it as a brief model. Go ahead and pause to read about Gwendolyn Brooks here. Okay. So as I say here, you've actually already read one of her pieces. It was an excerpt from Maud Martha, one of the AP Lit little quizzes on AP Classroom. But she was phenomenal as a poet, even though we did read that prose piece. And Brooks understands what Marilyn Nelson is saying, and indeed seems to be writing this poem to honor it. So this is called My Dreams, My Works Must Wait Till After Hell. If it's something that you are thinking of choosing, I don't want to force you to choose anything, but this is a wonderful one. It's sonnet form. It's specifically Shakespearean sonnet, ending with that couplet. I want to point out something that it does. It has slant rhyme. So the rhymes are not perfect. She is rhyming words like bread and lid, will and hell. Everything is like that all the way through, even down to the couplet at the end, insensitive and love. So the slants end on the same sound, but they don't have the same assonance, the vowel sounds in the middle. Why might she do that? Why would her sonnet be perfect in form, but reject perfect rhyme? I love thinking about form in this way, and we'll come back to it Wednesday. For now, we're trying to honor those words and phrases, what she might be choosing. What are the exact words that she is using to make her points? What is this poem saying through those words and phrases? By the way, here's a little moment where the AP exam will ask you that same question, but they'll ask in different ways. They'll say things like the poem's tone is best described as one of these words. And when you've read the poem, the correct answer is A. But there's more to it than that. Here are some other poems you can choose if you want to study the more to it. These are 3 other sonnets, all men, all masters of tradition, across a variety of cultures. So you have Pablo Neruda, amazing poet, perhaps the most important Latin American poet. Or you have Jorge Borges in the middle there, who's really more known as a translator and a literary critic, but wrote his own poetry. Or on the far right, Sir Philip Sidney, coming to us from the Shakespearean era, all writing sonnets. So here we are, Pablo Neruda's, Borges, and Sidney's. And you can choose one of those, but they're all linked by, of course, that sonnet form. You have a few other choices as well. The villanelles are perhaps most famous to you by the Dylan one, the Dylan Thomas one. But I love the bishop, and we'll come back to that on Wednesday too. What is a villanelle? Just briefly. It might not be a form you've seen before. And again, the exam will not ask you to define a villanelle, but they're going to ask that you notice when a poem has so much repetition in it as a villanelle does. So here's a structure of a villanelle, 5 stanzas, 3 lines each, and that last line of the stanza repeats back and forth between the different stanzas. Really, it's best felt when you see an example. So here's Bishop. Pause the slide to read her biography. We have studied her before in this class, and we will study her again next week. Bishop's one of my favorites. One art shows you the villanelle form at its finest. The art of losing isn't hard to master, to be lost, that their loss is no disaster. Those are the 2 refraining lines, and they'll switch at the end of each stanza back and forth until she repeats them in the last 2 lines of the poem. This poem is where I'll land for our words and phrases assignment. In this poem, we see that the diction and the syntax of the poem is really what defines it. The tradition, the villanelle, we'll come back to that, but the words and the phrases, which feels so, in some ways, elementary, words and phrases. And yet, to honor the words and phrases the poem seeks and chooses, that's where you're going to figure out what the poem is really trying to tell you. Here is my analysis of the words and phrases of the poem. The speaker in one art is rejecting the truth of her misery, though they cloak it well until the final stanza, when their self-awareness breaks through. So let's go back. The words and phrases I'm interested in are here, in this last stanza. It is not a small thing that we have a parenthetical here. And then these words, the joking voice. What? The tone totally changes on that moment. Joking. What's joking about this? All the way through, there's been a tone of a bit of irony. There's a constant obsession and repetition of the idea that you don't need to worry about something, which means you're worried about it. But for me, that all comes together in the last stanza. So here is my model of how you can understand the words and phrases, through my mind anyway, of this poem. And you can go ahead and pause this screen to read my analysis, see if you agree or not, but this is what I'm offering as what you could do for your creative analysis for the words and phrases of the poem you choose. Put in language that is more assignment driven, what are the connotations, representations, associations of specific words or phrases? How do words and phrases create ambiguous meanings and invite multiple interpretations? Pick a poem, any of the poems for week 1, and apply those questions to the poem. Use evidence from the poem to support your ideas. Don't worry about organization and structure. We'll do that Wednesday. For now, stay focused on how the meaning of the poem is coming through in those words and phrases.